Yes, please.
Can everyone hear my voice? Is it a good volume and everything? Okay. We're delighted to be here. I'm with two old friends and colleagues, Lawrence Marcelle, Larry, and Brendan Hogan. All of us have a philosophical background, but more specifically, we have long experience teaching ethics and related liberal subjects, liberal arts type curriculum to a variety of students in New York, in NYU, but also in the New School, and most specifically in two business-oriented degree programs based at Parsons School of Design. Larry and I, in particular, have taught many courses in that general space in quite an interesting interdisciplinary environment, a business program with a heavy design and design research emphasis. What we're going to do today is I'll be kind of like the setup guy. I'm not going to talk so much about pragmatism, but some of the typical, or at least atypical problems, something about the intellectual landscape that we have traversed in that space, so-called business ethics space for many years, a frustration that we have. Francois, you just talked about an unproductive difference in a different context. I'm going to introduce one of those in our job, in our sort of teaching environment, and then introduce very briefly a third possibility, the behavioral economics development and its recent application, nudge theory, to see if that could be a kind of productive third way in a kind of stale and unmoving debate within American management theory. I'm going to start with a reference to somebody probably everybody is familiar with, the famous position associated with Milton Friedman, often called shareholder primacy. Really, in effect, as a default matter of a descriptive account of how most business operates, certainly at the larger levels of, stockholder-owned, publicly traded companies. That's a pretty good default description. The shareholders are the primary stakeholder, the ones you have to take care of if you are in a responsible decision-making role. Executives, according to the very famous editorial that he published. Actually, and if you let me share screen, I can pull up a couple of pages while we do this. Familiar with everyone, and itself a popularization of his more detailed book, Capitalism and Freedom. Friedman makes the explicitly moral argument, and that's key to our point here. We're going to describe the two sort of competing so-called philosophies of business management and emphasize each of their attempts to ground their recommendation in something like a moral insight. The driving moral insight of Milton Friedman's position is transparently deontological. He makes an argument to the effect that for corporate executives to be spending, net profits after tax money is a form of stealing, or as he writes it in that editorial aimed at American audiences, it's a type of taxation without representation, right? It's really spending somebody's money without asking their permission first. This would be an effort at something like we would now call corporate social responsibility. If an executive took it on himself or herself to raise wages beyond what would be required in the market, to lower prices, to attach a scrubber on the smokestacks to collect pollution beyond what was mandated, those would be examples of spending on what Friedman derisively refers to as social goods. This is a clear position. It has a virtue of being able to give advice. Executives read that, digest it, know what to do when they go to their office the next day. It is a harsh position, though. It explicitly states you need to subordinate the interests of all stakeholders, employees, customers, the neighborhood, the community, and you could say the nation as a whole, in the form of minimizing outlays and sort of accountability to any of those groups in favor of the investors. The editorial might have been intended to sort of stop debate about do companies have responsibilities? Should they? Is a corporate legal person only a bearer of rights, not of responsibilities, and so forth and so on. Very familiar tropes in American media about business. This did not have that effect. It stimulated a response that has become so iconic that it shows up in every standard ethics textbook. I'm referring to the Milton Friedman editorial, and then right beneath it, I guess it's too small, is the famous, equally famous or infamous response position. associated with the American professor of business ethics, Edward Freeman. Similar name, very different position, since he's the champion of what is now called stakeholder management. Basically, the idea that you have to take care of everybody. Again, not a challenging idea in and of itself. It is an idea that draws primarily on the chief competitor to the Kantian deontological tradition. Namely, it is a recognizably utilitarian kind of insider argument. General welfare needs to be the criterion of success for business, not just a zero-sum prioritizing of one group over another, notwithstanding the contractual and fiduciary rights that are associated with that. I'm stylizing a little bit these two positions. For example, Friedman also offers a kind of consequentialist argument to the effect that things will turn out poorly if executives do start spending their after-tax profits. But I'm emphasizing the deontological force of the argument about no taxation without representation on the one hand, and the utilitarian insight or drive of the stakeholder position. The stakeholder position associated with Edward Freeman has been reiterated, reanimated many, many times. Here's one recent example that some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. This is like an instance or an example of the position that says you have to take care of everybody, and this is key, doing so can be profitable in the long run. It can actually be to the strategic advantage of the properly run company to take care of everybody, seeing every stakeholder's interest as joint, and understanding the role of the corporate manager as somehow raising all boats at once, or seeing to the interests and increasing the benefits to every stakeholder year on year. It sounds like magical thinking, and indeed it is, but for now we're just emphasizing this critical thesis that in this literature, and there is a literature around it, a lot of it's fairly bad, but nevertheless, the argument is that there is an overlap between strategic business advantage and moral obligation. These things can coincide in the business environment, and managers need to recognize that and act on that insight. Again, it's prudent to be moral is sort of the sloganistic way that I could summarize the stakeholder position. Now, this book, again, just one example, it's written by John Mackey. That was the guy who founded Whole Foods, the high-end grocery store chain. Now, in that book, which was co-written with a Harvard Business School professor, he essentially congratulates himself and a number of other prominent American firms for having achieved, in his view, a higher level of consciousness in running large corporate concerns, such that it is in fact possible to benefit all stakeholders year on year. And he makes that claim repeatedly in this book. The possibility, the actuality proves the possibility, right? He's holding up his own company as a kind of instance that illustrates that this is a way to operate. Leaving aside that the argument could be criticized sort of internally, like, for example, he wasn't very nice to his workers, prevented them from trying to unionize and so forth. So leaving aside traditional kinds of criticisms, we could just ask with Milton Friedman whether the discipline of the market would visit its harsh, logic onto that arrangement. And to the extent that John Mackey was, as he said, overpaying his workers, paying them more than Walmart, more than Trader Joe's, one would expect, just from the conventional understanding, the Milton Friedman understanding of the market, that would invite a competitor or else make the investors angry. If you're not aware, that's exactly what happened. And John Mackey was first, just a couple years after this book was published, he was forced off the board of directors of his own company that he had founded, and shortly after that was literally forced, the company itself was sold by under pressure from an activist investor. So it would appear that the sort of the Milton Friedman zero-sum counsel was factually accurate in that case. Meanwhile, if stakeholder management is sort of difficult to sustain in practice, and that's sort of the takeaway from that particular book, it might be that prudence and morality align temporarily, but those things, that alignment is very contingent and not likely to be very stable. What about the default or the de facto behavior of corporate executives? And I'm talking at the highest level of the biggest companies. Do they themselves pay even lip service to the idea that every stakeholder should be serviced or taken care of? No, not really. And then if you've been following some of the recent reporting about the earnings calls, you're probably aware that American corporate profits are way up, but so is inflation, consumer inflation. Now, there's been plenty of reporting that seeks to analyze account for that inflation. Some of it is clearly from supply chain problems stemming from the pandemic. Some of them come from the war in Ukraine. Some of it comes from corporate gouging, which is an intentional, optional decision to raise prices on their customers in order to raise revenues and profits, but without any rationale behind it in terms of the company's own supply chain being restricted or having. So I didn't say that very clearly, but what's been made very obvious in the earnings calls by American corporations over the past 4 or 5 months is that corporations are raising prices beyond what would be warranted by increases in their own production costs, well beyond. And they're completely open, public, and honest about that fact, at least when they're talking to the investors. And okay, so I'm not going to share the screen. There's a number of, I can put them into the chat if it's of interest, but this is a widely reported and public phenomenon. There's plenty of transcripts of some of these calls online, and they're full of quotes that make clear we are committed to raising our prices, taking advantage of the widespread expectation of continued price increases, which is the psychological basis for this decision. And we will do so up until the point at which further increases we calculate would cut into our sales volume. And that's how you know how to set a price. Yes,
Matthew,
Larry?
I'm going to intervene because we're down to about 4 minutes.
Okay.
So I'm going to add, if you don't mind.
No problem. Why don't you take over the nudge theory part then?
Okay. When I introduced Dewey here, the intervention comes from his book, Freedom and Culture, which I think can help us work our way or think through sort of the sterility that Matthew was talking about. This is written at a time following the Great Depression, when laissez-faire capitalism in the Lochner versus New York decision had been decided upon by the Supreme Court, that laissez-faire economics was mandated by the Constitution. In the wake of that failure of the Great Depression, under the threat of a democratic institution, John Dewey writes this book. And one of the master ideas is that our concept or understanding of freedom is not intelligible unless you understand it within the wider culture. So in Freedom and Culture, some of the direct ideas early on in the book is that human nature is inherently and exclusively individual, is itself a product of cultural individualistic movement. That's a quote from Dewey. He wants to contrast this with what he calls cooperation, called fraternity, he says, in the classic French formula. This is as much a part of democratic ideas as is personal initiative. The money quote I want to take is the way in which he's now going to view freedom only as it makes sense within the idea of a wider culture. He says a state of culture is a state of interaction of many factors, the chief of which are law and politics, industry, commerce, science, technology, the art of expression and communication, and of moral or the values men prize in the ways they evaluate them, until he gets to the idea of the widest, i.e. their social philosophy. So in part of the presentation of how do you overcome this is to understand that there's a kind of assumption of methodological individualism, of this idea of free liberal atoms. And one of Dewey's master thoughts, really one of the master thoughts of pragmatism, is that our concepts are tools. They are developed in history. So Dewey looks at the development of the idea of how we move from status to contract, the idea that you're born in a certain social level versus the idea you are a free individual. And he wants to say something of how it worked for its time, and now how it comes to be occlusive when you try to look at this problem of the threat to democracy, economic instability, and how would you move forward? So the idea of what management is for Dewey only makes sense within the wider cultural context. Who is to give the orders and who is to follow the orders? Since this is a book about the culture of democracy, part of the idea is that if you begin with this dichotomy of individuality, if you begin with the idea that laissez-faire systems are sort of written into nature, you transpose that into a dichotomy of people who manage and people who are managed. And then, as was mentioned in another lecture, the idea of your industrial aristocracy. We just want to check. I think I'm running out of time here. So the hope that Dewey has then is that if you take at the macro level, sort of what we might think of as just political questions, and understand that in every institution and the way we conduct our everyday lives, we already have forms of democratic processes. That's my time, of an ethos. And the suggestion is that you can only get a kind of normative framework out of the idea of managing a business, a for-profit company or institution, if at the micro level, the institution is itself imbued and sort of feeds back with the wider system of this democratic ethos. If there's time in the question, we can maybe discuss what behavioral economics, why it presents itself as a way out of the cul-de-sac, and why the sort of Deweyan thought suggests, no, it's just going to be one more sort of rat in the maze. Thank you for that. And Matthew, thank you for reminding me of the sterility of business ethics.
Thank you. Brendan, are you going to charge ahead?
I am. Thanks very much for that. And I want to thank Vincent for the invitation to speak here today. After attending the earlier panels, I realized this is a truly sort of philosophical approach to management. And as Matthew mentioned, I've taught business ethics and have turned to political philosophy. So I'm going to take up what I think is a kind of first step, a little upstream from a lot of the conversations today about management theory, and talk about, what is the position of a manager and how is it possible in the political economy we live in, and what does that mean? I think hopefully we'll bring out some of Dewey's deeper philosophical ideas here. And please jump in when I get to time. I can just wrap up in a minute or so. The opportunity to discuss the relationship of some of the original thinkers associated with the tradition of pragmatism to organizational and management philosophy is a welcome one, but also a bit fraught. The philosophical uniqueness that pragmatism heralds in its original self-understanding is captured by William James's turn of phrase, at once descriptive and exhortatory. He stated that pragmatism turns thought towards action, towards facts, and towards power. The three most well-known of the original pragmatists, Charles Sanders Peirce, James, and John Dewey, all aimed in their own particular way to overcome a variety of metaphysical and epistemological obstacles that would restrict philosophical analysis from actually taking its endpoint to be the solving of problems as they emerge in and through, again, James's phrase, the warp and the woof of human experience. Echoing this vision in 1919, Dewey referred to this as pragmatism's reorientation of philosophical criticism to focus on the problems of philosophers as opposed to the problems of human beings. Away from the problems of philosophers, and towards the problems of human beings. Pragmatism promises something of a rapprochement of even the most rarefied of exercises of our rational faculties and the full richness of world we inherit, and not just the environment that which we as a species have intentionally created, the habits and patterns of coping that have both shaped the ideational resources through which we interpret the world, and, crucial for my remarks here, the way in which our discourses are reduplicated in practices of pedagogy education, and remuneration at the highest levels of organized reflection, for instance, in our universities. I turn to Dewey at this point, as he had the most developed critique of the classical American pragmatists with respect to any society that would claim the moniker of democracy as descriptively adequate, or even more importantly, as normatively self-defining. The philosophical and theoretical writings of Dewey were never far from a social and political context in which Dewey was actively intervening as a public commentator and a social activist, putting his shoulder behind the wheel either at the founding or with the elevation of progressive institutions and causes. In short, as one of, if not the most singular philosophers of democracy in the English-speaking world of the last century, Dewey was in a constant struggle to clarify what democracy requires in terms of its practices. And in this respect, the world of business and economics was a large target of his conceptual labor for his entire career. Thus, I think that Dewey offers us the most interesting of philosophies, in tandem with Mead, of the classical pragmatists with respect to questions of both organizational and management theory, at least in their broad outlines. More recent thinkers, such as Roberto Frege in his Pragmatism and the Wide View of Democracy, have tried to put paid to some of the fundamental ideas in expanding the commitment to the most basic fundamental norms of democracy in a complex global situation composed of nation states, incredibly powerful non-state economic actors, as well as citizen action networks organized to address the problem emerging out of the synthesis of the first two, national governments and organized capital. I mention this recent work as it is typical of an attempt to extend the consequences of pragmatism to through the historical conjuncture at which our species sits. And in this, I find it both pragmatic and laudable, if not robust enough in its vision or its critique. That is to say, in the creativity required by a philosophy, as above, committed to solving the problems of humans as opposed to philosophers or management theorists. In these remarks, I would simply like to foreground three possible avenues for bringing classical pragmatism into contact with management theory. And I am aware that in different ways, they have already been brought into contact. But I want to emphasize some points with respect to each of these three. My purpose is not so much as to offer emendations to existing theories of management or to survey how pragmatism might critique existing theories of management, but rather to point out how historically many of the most widely taught and popular theories in existing institutions are historically and conceptually situated in a methodological position that elides the very touchstones of a pragmatic approach to human reality, even those that claim the moniker of being pragmatic. Contrary to many understandings of pragmatism, the fact that we must start where we are, without a theoretical blueprint for solving problems or a fanciful ideal heaven to retreat to, if only. Without this, it doesn't mean we are without the resources for radical critique, nor that we automatically choose the middle ground between two opposing theoretical alternatives as pragmatists. In fact, pragmatism must be radical. And for the sake of time, I will forego a quote from Dewey where he basically argues that any pragmatism and especially any liberalism must become radical and requires thoroughgoing changes to the institutions that have come to define liberal democracy at his time. The first Deweyan expression of this radicality emerged basically concomitantly with one of the more famous models of management theory, Taylorism. And by the time Taylor published his Theory of Scientific Management in 1910, Dewey was far down the road to developing his own understanding of human action, receiving its mature formulation in 1922 in Human Nature and Conduct. Very early in his long philosophical career, however, Dewey, in contrast to behavioral models that subsumed human action under the guise of a stimulus response mechanism of inputs and outputs, reconstructed the relationship between agent and their environment to be one of mutual influence and redirection, opening the possibility up for the agent to not simply be a reactive repository of sense data stimulus, but one that actively shaped what would become the ideational moment of an overarching circuit of action. The agent then was not a mere throughput, but a creative participant in the development of a total environment. Their responsiveness was a condition for the existing event of stimulus, or better understood, experience. The consequences for this kind of understanding were to put aside any particular social scientific model aimed at explanation on a causal nomotheoretic basis to court. More importantly, because of this novel understanding of the spontaneity at the root of all experience, Taylor's reduction of the worker to a tool or instrument in an overall scientific theory of management eviscerated the nature of the human being whose position as worker was somehow the insignia of and hallmark of the freedom of contract Larry mentioned, found under the banner of liberalism. It was not only, however, that Taylorism reduced the worker to a mere instrument without any of the spontaneity and creativity in their action that was the sine qua non of humanity. The fact was that the legitimating force behind the popularity of Taylorism was its scientificity. We will return in closing to the challenge that Dewey's model of human action poses for management theory. For now, Taylor's legitimation of his management theory as scientific creates a chasm that pragmatism actually set out to overcome. Though it is beyond the scope of this paper, other attempts at scientific management, such as Elton Mayo's, while closer to pragmatism and interdisciplinary spirit and pluralism of values, nonetheless still submerges questions at the heart of any pragmatic theory of democracy. What pragmatism shares with these two theories, that while they have been far critiqued, surpassed, and in some cases left behind by contemporary management theory, as I recognize, were nonetheless crucial at their time. And what pragmatism shares is the advocacy of science. I leave it to the experts in management theory to address whether physics envy still operates in management theory. Scientism, based upon the scientific pretensions of the classical pragmatists, has been a charge and source of misunderstanding that still rears its head from untutored Philistine and endowed professor sophisticates alike. I apologize for that flourish. For Dewey, the call for an experimentalist ethos, especially his advocacy for a culture based upon the norms of scientific inquiry that would emancipate people from the social imaginary of prior forms of social organization, such as aristocracy, feudalism, and yes, capitalism, led many critics to group pragmatism under the umbrella of a reductive kind of positivism or utilitarianism that reduced meaning to the verification principle or to consequentialism of values subject to a marginally wider view of calculation than Bentham's, respectively. However, the understanding of science is perhaps as good a place as any other from which to explicate the agent at the root of pragmatism's transformation of philosophy on the one hand and practice on the other. Now we have a quick note about the connection to Hegel here, which I will forego for the sake of time. Dewey's approach to just this question of the relation of theory to practice both illuminates why the critics who reduce pragmatism in the above ways are so badly off the mark and gives us a rich description of how the wider understanding of science as inquiry has consequences which redound to the market institutions which management theory concerns itself with, especially the managers' behavior themselves and their aims. Specifically, the introduction of the model of human world transaction noted above shifted the agent's engagement with the world to one that is primarily practical. In short, and for the sake of time, and we can return to this sort of practical starting point and the primacy of practical reason in pragmatism. But in short, the battery of concepts upon which our current coping rests is funded by the struggle of those members of our lineage that solved problems and conveyed these solutions through time. The radical character of pragmatism emerges here again, insofar as these conceptual resources only retain their validity, which pragmatically wear on their face a priori validity, only a contingent validity, or a validity that can only be earned through ongoing practical verification, in James Bowman's term. In other words, Epistemology's backward focus on generating justifications of propositions relating to realities over and done with is replaced by a forward-looking anticipation and hypothetical projection of the use of particularly successful concepts and methods in solving problems into new problematic situations. Knowledge and knowing continually awaits ongoing verification in context of problem solving. Finally, the third path to understanding where pragmatism might inform in management theory, the democratic element of this scientific inquiry into particularly social problems. Dewey's critique of existing institutions of his time was deep. He consistently drew out the antithetical character of both capital-based institutions, the capital-labor relation, and what he referred to as the domination inscribed within the hallmark of liberalism, the freedom of contract. I mentioned these larger social elements as they are the background or context in which management theory occurs. For Dewey, who in addition to putting forward a theory of social inquiry geared towards solving social problems through enlisting the agents affected by those problems, even at the ground level of problem definition, the top-down approaches of explanation-based social sciences is a distortion and contributes to the social pathology he located in the dehumanizing organization of the division of labor at his time. This background for Dewey poses two challenges to management today, because pragmatism poses fundamental challenges to the social system of capitalism to core. How to square the interests of capital and the interests of human beings without undermining the entire mechanism of short-term profits, returns for stockholders, as Mathew was diligently and expertly defining, right, which persist for all the triple bottom line rhetoric, et cetera. And secondly, how to carry out the imperatives of for-profit companies operating in a system uncontainable by states and that is destroying the conditions of human life on the planet. These are the two qualitative elements of our problematic situation that, from this pragmatic perspective, management theory should start with. And with Dewey, and if you don't think economic institutions can be brought into line with these norms, right, of a human future and a biologically viable future, then with any pragmatic approach to a future worth living in, so much the worse for existing institutions. On the first front, institutional and legal developments, just to give some hypothetical positive proposal, such as cooperatively owned and run firms, began to push back against the alienation Dewey spent decades responding to. But that is the position that pragmatism sits within the global problematic situation, as far as I can see it with respect to management and management theory. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brendan. Thanks to all of you for these three viewpoints. So it's time to open the floor to questions and comments or remarks.
Brendan, given that you're saying that management decisions, policies at the local level of a company would have to be situated and sort of imbricated in a much broader cultural and political environment, how do you imagine that might end up impacting, corporate policies, mission statement, or just the management labor relation, for example, in practical terms? Like, presumably workers should have more say over their own compensation, but how would you think that would work in sort of institutional terms?
Well, I mean, I think that in part you see an effort at trying to address some of the deficits in the way in which labor is organized through things like sort of the creative class or getting flex time or different ways of trying to accommodate something besides a sort of punch in, punch out mechanical reproduction of your sort of labor energy during the day. But I actually think part of the root of the problem is property relations. So, you know, I don't think anything is going to change until you're going to give these basically, you know, mega powerful institutions which can co-opt the space of democratic representation, as you know, there's tons of evidence for, unless something like the sort of incentives for surplus profit are either disincentivized through some profit sharing mechanism or something else. But I think it's at property and profit that other things follow. And in this, I'm a little bit different than some of the other pragmatists, political economists, and certainly business ethicists.
Mhm.
We have Damiano wanted to ask a question.
Thanks, Vincent. Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to follow the arguments here around pragmatism. And if I've understood it, if there's no universal or transcendent set of principles to govern ethics, in other words, one has to respond contingently to the situation, which I think is the pragmatist language from Dewey, then what saves it, and I'm not saying I'm sympathetic or unsympathetic, but what saves it from accusations that allows anything goes, and that there's largely an excuse for inconsistency amongst management declaring their ethical response to a contingent situation, which, you know, may entail them telling the workers to go left on this occasion, and tomorrow the same way it's told to go right. I just worry about that a little bit over the years with the limited understanding I have of pragmatism, but just skipping through the public and its problems, the Dewey book. I remember making notes in that was a kind of anxiety I had with it, or maybe an exhilaration with it at the same time, that it didn't seek universal principles. But then that suggests perhaps there's some kind of socialization, enrichment of education needed to prepare people for the challenges of responding to the ethical challenges in the moment and the contingencies of the moment, which would certainly resonate with my experience of trying to be an ethical ethnographer, or responding to the ethical challenges of being an ethnographer, particularly in large corporate organizations where I've had some experience over the years.
I think Brendan may also want to take this. I'll just make sort of one small point, because this sometimes comes up when you're teaching ethics and you go through the pragmatism, that it's a sort of anything goes philosophy. I think part of what I think Dewey is especially good at is going to suggest that the idea that there actually are sort of these a priori principles, or that you can attach to the world in something more than a contingent manner. If you can understand why that's sort of a fantasy, it sort of is designed to kind of reduce this anxiety. So you'll go through something very akin to a genealogy of a set of ethical concepts. And what he wants to show is that they all developed in this contingent manner. So it's not as though you can say pragmatism is taking something away from you or forbidding you from having this higher set of principles. What it wants to say is something like, that was just a fantasy anyways. Nothing has been taken away from you. Nothing has been barred from you. And I'm not sure if that's Brendan's take or if he has something else to add to that.
Well, I mean, there is that therapeutic element of pragmatism that thinkers like Rorty like to push. But Dewey is much more positive in proposals about what we learn from the fact that we do not have something like a foundation or certainty with respect to absolute ends towards which we ought to behave, that we can use in different problematic contexts. And the reason we think we do, according to Dewey and his genealogy of our morality, is because we have discovered through inquiry very good ways to solve our problems that generate certain norms that seem to be quite ethical and moral and not necessarily practical concrete norms. Norms like respect, duty, dignity, respecting the dignity of somebody. But for Dewey, these are rooted in ways to organize and motivate types of cultures that have been successful and things that we want to promote and sustain in the future, because they actually help us solve even more problems, right? That's one reason, but also because we just believe they're right, right? We just don't believe they're right because there's some transcendental justification for them. And we don't know what they're going to mean, these norms we've inherited and we carry with us in new contexts. And this is why we have to be experimental with respect to how we solve problems, and to continually understand that we're never going to get the final description. We're never going to get the final moral of all morals, which we can carry in our hip pocket, which inscribes within itself how to apply it, right? Because of that being an inaccessible kind of theoretical goal for human beings, right? And once we see that's impossible, we haven't really been denied anything at all when someone says to us, there is no absolute fundamental truth, right?
Yeah,
Brendan,
thanks.
Lawrence.
Thanks.
Oh, sorry.
Thanks, Brendan. Yeah, I just wanted to thank for those detailed responses. Of course, when somebody says there is no fundamental truth, that kind of sounds like a fundamental truth claim as well.
That's right. And certainly you might say, aren't you being self-performatively inconsistent? But only from the perspective that that's an available option for you, right? I think pragmatism actually says, okay, there might be in the future, but we haven't found one yet. So we're going to go actually with the fact that we probably don't have the fundamental truth, and we're going to keep working as good as we can with what we got and keep going forward.
I think Romain was next. Please, Romain.
Thank you. Just a few remarks about this question of no fundamental truth. This is very central, yes. Precisely because I want to relate that to my own speech. Dewey was favorable to sophists. In the reconstruction to philosophy, in philosophy, he explicitly in the first pages say how the sophists were pragmatic, near from the making of things, and how they were despised. They were made a bad name by Plato and Aristotle. So this is, secondly, Durkheim, in his Sociology and Pragmatism, attacks the pragmatists on the basis that they do not believe in fundamental truth. And he says that they recognize it themselves, because one of them was called Schiller, who was a British, I think, said of himself that he was Protagorean. Now then Rorty, he's making the introduction of the preface to the reconstruction of economics, saying it is the best book in the world and so on. And he never speaks about sophism in all his book. The only times he speaks about sophistic Protagoras is to say how Feyerabend is wrong. And then the last thing I want to say, and that all these things are linked, in his, Dewey wrote a preface or an introduction to the new edition of his book, Reconstruction in Economics, in the 46. And people were asking him, would you change? So he says, people were asking me, do I want to change something in the book? And he says, no, I don't want to change the content. The only thing I would change would be the title. It was called Reconstruction in Philosophy, and I would like to call it reconstruction of philosophy. But it's just a comment to see how fragile is the reference to Dewey. I mean, we use it as a very it's very comforting, I mean, because he's nice and he gives hope. But if you look at his own point of view in the 46, and the way Rorty tries to avoid all the problems with sophism and so on, you see there is a problem. As philosopher, people should be interested. As practitioner, no.
Mathew, Brendan, Lawrence, I don't know if you wanted to react or we maybe. Okay, I don't, was it Hunter next?
Okay, sure. I don't know if it was me or Matt, but yeah, I thought this really fascinating discussion. I really appreciate your talk, Brendan. So I think I've always thought Dewey was a fascinating, and one of the things I really liked you mentioned is how central sort of democracy and process are to his thinking, right? That in a lot of ways, even when he's writing about psychology or really anything, he's writing about democracy and trying to resolve its problems. And I think he's underlying so many things is an idea that kind of in an uncertain world, democracy is what you got. And that pragmatism is essentially kind of operationalizing democracy in the world of philosophy, right? There's a certain appeal to that, right? Of course, that runs into problems when you actually don't have a shared underlying value set. There actually isn't something that's sort of accepted as fundamental, as when you have a democracy that's riven by racial division. And then that problem solving doesn't work, right? Or works only for some and not for others. And so it's a fascinating challenge. And of course, when we're talking about managerial thinking, one thing he and so many others of his generation were preoccupied with is what is the role of the expert in a democracy? If the manager is the new kind of expert, you know, some people really do know better or know more. You know, what do you do in a world where, like, okay, we have the opinion of these 10 physicists, and then we have Enrico Fermi's opinion over here. Which one are you going to go with? Well, I'm going to go with Fermi, right? So, you know, well, how do you handle that sort of thing when your fundamental commitment is to democracy? That way, and so you know, I think at some point some of his resolutions are a little fuzzy, but so would mine, because if you've got those commitments, it's tough. Yeah. But the last thing I'd say is also, I think it really helped me understand Dewey a lot to read a piece by him from the 1890s, so quite an early piece about the influence of evolution on philosophy. I actually make my undergrads read it. It's only 10 pages long, and it takes them like 5 hours because it's written in Dewey speak. But really, what he's talking about is what evolution does intellectually is create this world where what we're trying to understand is contingent patterns of relationships, and that knowledge of this, it's done away with the concept of species, which is a fundamental organizing a priori principle, and created a world in which all we have are contingent patterns of relationships, and that's what you got. And what we need is a way of understanding that works for that world. And pragmatism is the way that works for that world. And so it's not so much a question as a comment that I think your talk resonated very much with a number of problems that I've seen with trying to understand Dewey in context.
Wonderful. Larry, will you take up the technocratic point? I know you were going to speak to that, but I know that's been something you've been working on because behavioral economists constantly dealing with the charge of paternalism and that kind of thing. So, I mean, Hunter had a very rich comment, but I think that's something you might speak to.
Yeah, I'll just say something very briefly about sort of the role of the expertise and the technocrat. I think what you get out of Dewey, as Brendan was mentioning, processes of inquiry generate either sort of positive or negative feedback. So the idea of an expert in physics or an expert doctor is going to make a lot of sense to Dewey. Why? Because the past has already funded that. It's given us a kind of pattern of inquiry. When it comes to other sort of wider social problems, take like the idea that behavioral economists are going to be able to overcome some of the shortcomings of rational choice theory by sort of manipulating our psychological statuses so we get what we would have wanted had we been fully rational. Dewey's sort of critique at that level of expertise is that it's not funded by a rich history of inquiry that has been successful in solving problems. Sort of the opposite. It's sort of failure and the inability to change your experimental attitude in light of these failures. You're just still trying to commit yourself to these points. So I think why you get democracy in certain areas, especially solving social problems, is because you have no form of inquiry which has generated these experts.
Thanks, I like that.
One of the examples we had talked about before the day was the nudge theory or the behavioral management or idea to better manage retirement savings. So this is one of the nudge people's big arguments. We ought to make it so that instead of having to click a checkbox on the HR website to choose to start saving money and have a percentage of your pre-tax income carved off, excuse me, we should require people to opt out of that instead of opting in. And because the reason being, many people never opt in, they forget about it, and then they have less money for retirement. So that's, overcoming and working around that common quirk of human nature that we just tend to click through websites or go with the flow or to choose the default option, whatever it may be, is supposed to be a way that we can, on one hand, preserve the freedoms and respect the integrity of the individual along the lines of a broadly Kantian moral position, while at the same time clearly enhancing their welfare, since they'll have more money at when they retire or not. Some of the arguments that show up from a Deweyan standpoint there is that it answers a whole bunch of questions about what a human being is and whether that really is an appropriate kind of paternalism for that expert in this unfunded situation, as Larry just said, to make decisions about how a very abstract kind of planning about financial futures that extends out years and decades. One of the arguments is against nudge theory is that really takes something away, and we should have, in a way, a right to make poor decisions. And if that is taken away, that's bad paternalism in a sense that would be, we should all reject that. And the broader political issues like, why have we decided that retirement savings is predominantly the responsibility of the individual? I mean, that entire philosophical position is bypassed and just presumed by the behavioral initiative to promote retirement savings through setting the defaults correctly. And it's that kind of bypassing that violates a more robustly Deweyan understanding. And that's the kind of place where, putting it crudely, more democracy probably makes sense. At least to involve the employees in decisions about those policies themselves, and consulting with what kind of nudges they might like would be more democratic and more ethical.
So kind of democratic decision on the defaults.
Yeah, and again, that does not allow an objection about the doctor, because as Larry said, there's a basis there. There's a body of settled knowledge about biology, whereas there really isn't about how should people avoid eating cat food 30 years from now. That's not an empirically grounded thing that you just sort of plug in the results. It's a philosophical, moral, and political question. Therefore, it should be handled more broadly. think that's the Deweyan position. I'm done.
Laurie, you wanted to ask a question?
Yes, but I realize we're probably over time from this session. What's the status on that before I engage into? Since my comments, I had two, and they kind of relate to earlier things because I had two kids dangling on me before, so I couldn't fully participate. So is it okay to jump back a little bit, or are we in a flow of moving forward?
François-Xavier, is it okay?
Yes, and I have a proposition at this stage. So let's keep 3, 4, 5 minutes more for this panel. And I just discussed with Pierre what we'll do next as a less ambitious option than what appears in the program, which is that we will merge the Agora and concluding discussion, and we propose to everybody just to be in the Zoom link of Agora 1, and we will have a general discussion around the topic of the workshop, and this will be the concluding time. We will take half an hour for an intense last discussion around everything, and we forget the 2 Agoras plus the concluding discussion. We will do that because we feel, in particular for all of those who are jet lagged, in the liminality of the jet lag, that it's a little bit beyond what we can do for the next step. So let's keep 3-5 more minutes for the panel, and let's conclude with the link devoted to Agora 1.
Okay, I'll go through list of my 3 random points then. One being,
yes,
about,
of course. Just excuse me. Just something, of course, very, very important. We don't remove the third and last keynotes.
You're muted.
So Xavier, we don't hear you.
Yes, sorry, my mic was muted. I was just saying that, of course, there will be the third keynote. I was just describing at the end of the train, but what we could do to conclude a little bit earlier. I think our people in the European time will be too in the middle of the night.
Peter is not affected by this.
So,
Peter
yes,
is not
yes.
affected by it.
But of course,
not.
there will be the third keynote.
So shoot, okay. Guys.
So first point was about the juxtaposition of stakeholder capitalism and then Milton Friedman's way of giving the ethical rules of how managers should behave. Isn't one way of viewing them not as even a juxtaposition? It's almost like the other one is just incredibly simple first step. And the stakeholder capitalism actually fulfills Milton Friedman's point, but just more holistic.
Can you put your mic on? Can you mute your mic, Pierre, please?
Sorry.
Thanks.
The basic stakeholder capitalism just takes a longer time horizon in what Milton Friedman is saying is the role of the corporation, and includes more variables. So your example of Whole Foods, we said that the Milton's capitalism won, since Whole Foods went to Amazon. It won now, but it's also that they were all wrong. It's not necessarily that it won because it's better. It just won because everybody were thinking the same way, as optimizing with those same short-term criteria, and within that frame of mind, yes, they won. But of course, it's like, if the million flies, the metaphor, so might be correct here. And then the other point was about just a random nugget about the discussion of the eternal truth and the existence of eternal truth, and how pragmatism, methodically rejects the existence of eternal truth. But in many ways, isn't it obvious that there's the while the eternal truth necessarily takes the form of not to be conceptualized, or the manifestations of the truth necessarily are different all the time, and hence we need to inquire every situation separately, into every situation separately, but that humans have that drive that drives us, and that's what separates us from, you know, an AI. AI can do all sorts of stuff, but somebody needs to input what it's optimizing for, right? And humans have that.
Take 20 times.
Somewhere under the layers anyway. So that was the second point, and I will leave my third point to the midnight or AM discussion.
Let me respond very quickly to the first point about, doesn't the failure of Whole Foods or the failure of the vision to taking care of everybody show that Milton Friedman is right? Yes, I agree with that. That is a more descriptively accurate assessment of how American business works. But it's a cruel system. And so to me, that just shows the need for much more rigorous and robust democratic oversight and regulation of business activity. That's the only way. I basically agree that corporate responsibility is kind of a nonsense expression. The way corporations are structured, including legally, makes it not realistic to expect that corporations could, let alone should, be the agents or vehicles of achieving something we would call a just society. No, I think that's the job for governments. And for better or worse, in this free market system, we really have prioritized a kind of zero-sum competition as the normative and sort of institutionalized form. It has benefits. It generates a lot of wealth. It has deficits. The wealth is distributed unequally. So that just calls for, you know, government supervision of business. But I agree with you that Milton Friedman is a better describer of business than a CSR kind of picture or a business ethics type of defense. Maybe someone else can take the other harder question. I didn't want to take that. Larry, that's going to have to be you.
I'm sorry, the other question was about the idea of fundamental truths. And just so I make sure I'm getting the point, the manner in which they might not be sort of linguistically conceptual. I'm not sure if I quite got the gist.
No, the gist was, well, I'll try to express the gist, that don't humans kind of necessarily, that's kind of one clear thing that separates humans from an AI, for example, that there is the inherent something that we, you know, the reference point that we have whenever we are doing an inquiry in a situation, there is something we are optimizing against, even though it's not conceptualized.
Right. But Brendan might want to take this, but I will say my understanding of sort of Dewey is that there is something we will call a drive to knowledge. It's just that classically conceived, it just can't be thought of knowledge as a kind of representation or a picture of the truth. I think you sometimes get closer to phenomenology, where if you want to use like truth, it's just there, right? It's what you're actually dealing with without a kind of conceptual mediation. So I do think you get that in Dewey. It just looks so outside the standard history of Western philosophy that in many ways you can see, no, the pragmatists are not going to talk about a drive to knowledge, right? There just have to be reconstructed in a kind of Deweyan language, right? Which is why a 10-page essay takes you 5 hours to read. Brendan, I know if you wanted to.
I basically follow Larry on this point. I mean, you know, knowledge is such a different thing for pragmatists and involves the reconstruction of a problematic situation into a resolved one. So it has a sort of existential, experimental, ongoing, practical verification through time, such that, you know, that's why he sort of said it's warranted assertability is what our sort of truth claims amount to. And there are all sorts of issues with that, but I just don't think Dewey was that interested in pinning down that definition for all the problems it has when knowledge can do the thing he needs to do for solving problems, which is very dissatisfying to those who want something more.
François-Xavier, do we have time for Romain, please?
Thank you. Just a small comment about knowledge, because we have talked about nudge, and nudge has got a Nobel Prize in economics. So it is the utmost knowledge piece of knowledge we can imagine. Excuse me, once again, I will say one thing. Nudge technically is nothing else but marketing, precisely marketing. And I would say the first move in marketing of nudge is not to call itself marketing. It is the only difference between nudge and marketing. There will, and of course you will know, but what is it? Otherwise it's just applying social psychology to orient people behavior. That's what consumer behavior does all the time. So to give consumer behavior a Nobel Prize in economics as being the best you can do is a proof that there is a tendency to generalize rhetoric even in the field of knowledge. And that is not against Dewey, because Dewey was not against marketing, at least against sophism, but he knew there were problems.
You use marketing in a broad sense that you did earlier today that includes speech that is intended to influence specifically. Is that a fair, broader characterization of how you use this term? It's way beyond selling, the way you're talking about marketing.
It is way beyond selling. No, I define it as a bureaucratic form of sophism, and which means that if you do the parallel, you see, there are similitudes and there are differences, if you like. Similitude in a negative. It's a worse insult you can give to a philosopher is that you are a sophist, and the content is exactly the same as marketing. They don't believe in truth. They don't respect tradition. They are polymaths with one technique, rhetoric. They do everything, and they are foreigners, which is also very interesting.
Sorry, Romain.
Yes,
but this will be the concluding words of this.
But I mean, it's strictly the same thing, apart from bureaucracy.
Yes. Thank you, Romain. Thanks to all the panelists. We will stop at this point. Thank you very much for this very inspiring discussion. And we will come back to several issues discussed now during the concluding discussion, because it feeds a lot of our debate, all what has been said. So let's move to the keynote. And then, as we announced, there won't be Agora plus concluding discussion. We'll directly go after the keynote to the concluding discussion, and we will take 25-30 minutes to try to come back to some core topics that have been raised today about our workshop. So see you soon, see you now on the link for the third keynote speech, and I will introduce it. See you soon.
Vincent.